Ladies and gentlemen, history does not change with noise, it changes with courage. And sometimes a single moment can redefine the way the world sees itself. Today, we are living through such a moment. For decades, the story of Palestine was told as if it belonged to tomorrow, always postponed, always waiting. But now, the world has taken a step that no one thought possible so soon. The recognition of Palestine is not only about politics or borders, it is about the human spirit, about justice delayed finally breaking through the silence, and about a voice that can no longer be ignored. When eras end, new ones begin. And when the world shifts, the question is not whether you notice it, it is whether you understand it, whether you act on it, and whether you learn from it. That is why we are here, to understand why this recognition stuns the world, why it matters to Europe, and why it may change the global order for generations. I want you to stay with me until the end of this speech, not just to hear the facts, but to feel the weight of this moment. Because what we are discussing today is not a story about someone else. It is a lesson for all of us. It is about resilience, it is about the balance of power, and it is about the courage to choose values over convenience. By the time we finish, you will see that this recognition is not only the end of an era, it is the beginning of something the world has been waiting for. Now let's begin. The recognition of Palestine as a state represents more than just a diplomatic move. It stands as a historical turning point that reshapes the way the world understands justice, sovereignty, and the balance of power in international relations. For decades, the Palestinian struggle for recognition has been framed as an unresolved conflict caught between regional disputes and the calculations of global superpowers. With this recognition, however, the long-standing narrative of waiting for a solution has shifted into a moment of affirmation that acknowledges the existence and rights of a people who have endured one of the most complex and painful conflicts of the modern era. It is not just about Palestine being recognized. It is about the global community acknowledging that the world can no longer sidestep an issue that has shaped international politics for more than 70 years. This development closes a chapter defined by hesitation, failed negotiations, and the imbalance of power where Palestine was often excluded from being seen as a legitimate actor. Instead, it opens a new phase where the conflict must be discussed on terms that respect sovereignty and statehood. It changes the diplomatic equation because conversations can no longer proceed as if Palestine does not exist as a political reality. This recognition shifts the focus from whether Palestine deserves legitimacy to how the world will engage with it as a recognized entity, making it harder for major powers to dismiss the Palestinian voice in global forums. The symbolism of this move is as powerful as its practical implications. Recognition of Palestine highlights that justice delayed is not always justice denied, and that global solidarity, when it converges, can bring about real change. It also marks a generational shift. Younger populations across the world, especially in Europe, have increasingly demanded that governments stand for values of fairness, equality, and self-determination. In that sense, this recognition reflects not only a political decision, but also a moral awakening on the international stage. When historians look back at this moment, it will not be seen simply as a bureaucratic decision or a matter of foreign policy strategy. It will be remembered as the point where the tide of global diplomacy began to turn, where an era of silence and ambiguity gave way to a new phase of clarity and recognition, and where the question of Palestine could no longer be treated as an unresolved dispute, but rather as a defining reality of world politics. Europe's role in the recognition of Palestine carries a unique weight because of its history, its values, and its position in the global order. Unlike other power blocs, Europe has always presented itself as the guardian of diplomacy, balance, and human rights. For decades, European nations have walked a delicate line, often expressing support for a two-state solution, but hesitating to take concrete steps toward recognizing Palestine. This hesitation has been tied to strategic concerns, alliances with the United States, energy ties with the Middle East, and security commitments within NATO. Yet now, with recognition gaining momentum, Europe faces a decisive moment, whether to lead boldly or risk being seen as a follower in one of the most significant geopolitical shifts of our era. Europe has long been a stage for major turning points in world history, from the end of colonial empires to the creation of the European Union itself. That legacy gives it a special responsibility to demonstrate that diplomacy can bring about justice rather than merely manage crises. The recognition of Palestine forces Europe to look inward and ask whether its policies have truly aligned with its stated principles of freedom, equality, and the right of all peoples to self-determination. For many citizens across the continent, particularly younger generations, this issue has become a test of Europe's moral compass. If Europe claims to champion human rights, then this recognition becomes more than a foreign policy decision. It becomes a defining test of credibility. At the same time, Europe cannot ignore the strategic dimensions. Recognition has the power to recalibrate relations not only with the Middle East, but also with global players like the United States, China, and Russia. By asserting its stance, Europe shows that it can act as an independent center of influence rather than relying solely on the policies of Washington. But this independence matters at a time when global power is increasingly multipolar, and when nations are looking for new forms of leadership that blend pragmatism with moral clarity. For Europe, the recognition of Palestine is therefore not just about supporting one nation's statehood. It is about redefining what it means to lead in the 21st century. It is about stepping beyond symbolic declarations and accepting the responsibility to drive genuine progress in peace, stability, and international law, showing the world that Europe's voice still carries the weight of principle as well as power. The recognition of Palestine has sent shockwaves through the geopolitical landscape, challenging the assumptions and strategies of the world's most powerful players. For decades, the issue of Palestine was often managed rather than resolved, treated as a point of negotiation rather than a matter of justice. With formal recognition, however, the ground has shifted beneath the feet of global powers. Washington, long seen as the primary broker in the Middle East, is now forced to reassess its influence as other nations assert a different vision of diplomacy. The recognition undercuts the monopoly of American-led peace processes and signals that the world is no longer willing to wait for solutions shaped exclusively by U.S. interests. For Israel, this moment represents a profound challenge. Its diplomatic strength has rested on strategic alliances, regional normalization deals, and the assumption that international hesitation would prevent Palestine from gaining legitimacy. Recognition directly undermines that foundation, creating pressure on Israel to rethink its security strategies, its negotiations, and even its approach to international law. And it also complicates its relationships with countries that have chosen to acknowledge Palestine, shifting alliances in ways that could refine the region for decades to come. The ripple effects extend far beyond the Middle East. In Riyadh and other Gulf capitals, recognition forces a recalibration of strategies that were built on balancing relations with both the West and Israel. Arab states that once prioritized economic partnerships and regional stability over the Palestinian cause now face renewed expectations from their populations to respond decisively. For China and Russia, this moment opens new opportunities to position themselves as champions of a multipolar world, offering an alternative to Western-led diplomacy and strengthening their influence across the global South. What makes this development so significant is not just the recognition itself, but the message it sends. The balance of power is shifting. Nations that once remained on the sidelines are stepping forward, and their collective decisions are changing the trajectory of global politics. The recognition of Palestine has transformed what was once considered a frozen conflict into a defining test of international order, signaling that no power, no matter how dominant, can permanently suppress the demand for legitimacy and justice. In doing so, it has unsettled old strategies, disrupted established alliances, and created a new geopolitical reality that the entire world must now confront. The recognition of Palestine highlights one of the oldest dilemmas in global politics, the clash between moral responsibility and strategic interests. For decades, governments around the world have spoken about justice, human rights, and the principle of self-determination. Yet, when it came to Palestine, these values were often compromised in favor of political calculation. The recognition marks a moment when that contradiction can no longer be ignored, as states must reconcile their stated commitment to universal rights with the realities of alliances, economic dependencies, and military strategies. At the heart of the moral responsibility lies a simple truth. Millions of Palestinians have lived for generations without a state, without equal rights, and under the shadow of conflict. The demand for recognition is not merely a political aspiration, but a plea for dignity, security, and the ability to determine their own future. Acknowledging this is consistent with the very principles that international institutions like the United Nations were built upon. From a moral standpoint, recognition is not only justifiable, it is overdue. It affirms that human rights are not selective privileges granted to some nations while denied to others. Yet the strategic interests of global powers have often overshadowed this moral clarity. Oil trade routes, arms deals, and security cooperation have historically shaped how countries engage with the Middle East. For many Western nations, particularly in Europe and North America, maintaining alliances with Israel and other regional partners was seen as essential to stability, even if it meant postponing justice for Palestine. Similarly, regional actors have often used the Palestinian cause as leverage in their own power struggles, speaking in its name, but acting in pursuit of their own interest. Recognition disrupts this dynamic by making neutrality or silence less sustainable. It forces nations to choose between upholding their declared values or continuing to prioritize strategic interest at the cost of credibility. For Europe especially, this moment is a test of whether it can demonstrate that moral responsibility does not have to be sacrificed for political pragmatism. By recognizing Palestine, countries send a message that justice and strategy need not always exist in opposition, that long-term peace and stability can only emerge when moral principles are taken seriously. This shift in perspective does not resolve all contradictions, but it redefines the terms of debate, making justice an unavoidable factor in the strategic calculus of global politics. The recognition of Palestine marks a moment where the voices once pushed to the margins are now shaping the global stage. For decades, smaller nations and collective movements in the global south expressed solidarity with Palestine, yet their influence was often muted by the dominance of major powers who dictated the terms of international diplomacy. Recognition changes this equation dramatically, signaling the end of silence and the rise of voices that refuse to be overlooked. It shows that the world is no longer defined solely by the decisions of Washington, Brussels, or Tel Aviv, but also by the collective weight of nations that demand justice and equality in international law. This shift represents a profound rebalancing of influence. Countries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia have long supported Palestinian aspirations, but their recognition was often dismissed as symbolic by global powers. Today, when recognition gathers momentum from both smaller and larger nations, it demonstrates that collective voice can no longer be sidelined. It is a reminder that legitimacy does not flow only from military might or economic dominance, but also from moral conviction and the persistence of global solidarity. The international stage is being reshaped by this chorus of voices amplifying the idea that justice can no longer wait on the timetable of the powerful. But for the Palestinian people, this moment is deeply symbolic. It reflects the power of perseverance, the ability to keep telling their story even when it seemed the world has stopped listening. Recognition proves that silence is not permanent, that voices denied for decades can still reshape history. It restores dignity and offers hope that global acknowledgement is not an impossible dream, but a lived reality. For Europe and other influential regions, this development carries a challenge. It compels them to listen more closely to the voices of those who have historically been excluded from shaping the global agenda. If ignored, these voices will not fade away. They will grow stronger, supported by shifting global dynamics, where emerging economies and alliances in the global south are increasingly confident in asserting their place. Recognition of Palestine, therefore, is not only about one nation's struggle, but also about a broader reordering of the international system, where the era of silence gives way to an era of participation, inclusion, and accountability for all voices. The recognition of Palestine does not mark the end of the conflict, but rather the redefinition of its framework. For decades, peace efforts have stalled because negotiations were structured around an imbalance, with one side recognized as a legitimate state and the other treated as a question mark, a political entity waiting for approval. With recognition, that imbalance shifts. Palestine now steps onto the international stage not as a cause or a humanitarian issue alone, but as a state actor with the right to participate in shaping its own destiny. This changes the way future peace talks, economic rebuilding efforts, and security arrangements will unfold, because they must now be conducted on terms of mutual statehood rather than unilateral concessions. The implications for peace are profound. Recognition strengthens the argument that any lasting settlement must treat Palestine as an equal party, not a subordinate. It sets a new precedent for international mediation by reinforcing the idea that negotiations are meaningful only when both sides hold legitimacy. This shift may not bring immediate peace, but it forces a recalibration of diplomatic language, strategy, and expectation. It creates conditions where discussions can address core issues, borders, security, resources, and sovereignty on a more balanced footing. Economically, recognition opens new possibilities. International organizations, investors, and development partners are more likely to engage with Palestine as a recognized state, enabling greater opportunities for rebuilding infrastructure, creating jobs, and fostering growth. This has the potential to transform the conflict from one defined solely by political disputes into one where economic progress becomes part of the solution, a population that sees hope in education, work, and mobility is less likely to be trapped in cycles of despair and violence. On the international front, Palestine's recognition places new responsibilities on its leadership as well. With legitimacy comes accountability. The world will expect governance that is transparent, institutions that are functional, and policies that are forward-looking. For Palestinians, this is both a challenge and an opportunity to demonstrate that statehood is not just symbolic, but a pathway to stability and progress. For the global community, it is a chance to reframe its involvement, moving from crisis management to constructive partnership. Recognition, therefore, sets the stage for a future where peace is no longer a distant dream, but a realistic pursuit, grounded in the principles of equality, sovereignty, and shared responsibility. In conclusion, the recognition of Palestine is not simply a political gesture. It is the closing of one chapter and the opening of another in our shared history. It is the end of an era where silence, hesitation, and imbalance define the conversation, and the beginning of a time when justice, dignity, and equality are no longer abstract ideals but living realities. This moment challenges every nation, especially in Europe, to reflect on what it means to lead, what it means to uphold values, and what it means to shape a world that future generations will inherit. Recognition is not the solution in itself, but it is a foundation upon which peace, prosperity, and genuine dialogue can be built. It signals that the world is moving forward, that the collective voice of humanity is stronger than political hesitation, and that a more balanced international order is within reach. As we stand at this turning point in history, let us carry forward the courage to act, the wisdom to listen, and the resolve to build a future where no people are left unseen or unheard. Good luck to all of you who continue to play a role in shaping that future. And thank you for lending your hearts and minds to this conversation today.